Hey guys, Chapter 11, Section 4, as promised, protecting and sustaining our wetlands. We want to protect the remaining wetlands, of which unfortunately have gone down at an alarming rate, and restore degraded wetlands. That's our whole aspect for this. Protect what we got left and restore some along the way. Coastal and inland wetlands have been disappearing at an alarming rate, and there's a lot of reasons for it. But ultimately, the ecosystem services that these things provide are something we cannot afford to lose. So let's take a look at why we care about wetlands. I know growing up, I literally remember my dad talking about, yep, they'll sell you swampland in Florida. This idea of like swampland was always bad. It was just mosquito infested and horrible things. And we just wanted to get rid of them. I just remember growing up, and that was the idea in my head when you talked about swamps, marshes. It was a horrible place to be. Well, the reality is these things do a tremendous amount for all of us. They feed the downstream rivers. The wetlands tend to hold and store the water in them, and this is what typically is feeding into the river systems that's carrying fresh water to most of our cities. They reduce flooding. We get heavy rains and etc. That water has to go somewhere, especially when we get a really heavy rain shower, which in Florida we get all the time. So these reduce flooding because the water tends to go to these normal natural wetlands as a place to hold and store it. They reduce storm damage. Once again, when the rains come, we get a lot more flooding in the places where we've eliminated wetlands, covered them in, turned them into something else. The flooding tends to cause a lot more economical damage. They also recharge our groundwater supplies. These wetlands, it takes a long time for water to drift down through the soil, through the limestone, into the aquifers. It's not like it rains and boom, it's down there. If you water stuff, you put water on and it doesn't make it down there. You got to keep water. It takes a long time for that water to soak in. Our wetlands are what recharge our aquifers and a lot of this underground water systems. You get rid of them, the water doesn't have time to sit. It just runs off into the rivers and out and down, and our aquifers are not refilling at a rate that we need, especially at the rate we're pulling water out of the ground. They reduce pollution. Wetlands are phenomenal at taking pollutants out. Once again, think about their net primary production area. They're off the chart because it's lots of weeds and grasses, and these things grow really quickly. And they'll take whatever's in the water, they're soaking up into the plants. And if a piece of grass gets a little too much pollution and it dies, well, another one replaces it very quickly. But it's pulling those pollutants out of the ground and then converting them into the sugars, etc., into the system. And they clean up our water supply. So it comes into the wetlands soak a lot of this pollution up. And by the time the water makes it down into the river systems or into the aquifers, it's been cleaned up by the marshes and wetlands. We get rid of them, and this isn't happening. They simply prevent erosion. Once again, the NPP, the net primary production of marshes, estuaries, swamps is incredible. So all this vegetation is preventing erosion. The water's coming in and settling. We've got the stuff that keeps this flow slow, if you will. And they just provide a habitat for many fish and wildlife, birds, etc. They require these areas for their survival, and then we're using them for all kinds of things, whether it's recreation, food sources, you name it. But just our wildlife need, some of them absolutely can't survive without wetlands. So these are just a handful, if you will, of the ecosystem services. Why do we care? Well, all of these reasons are why we care about our wetlands. Now, people have drained, filled in, and covered them at least since the 1900s. I'm sure it was going on before then. But we've learned the technology to do it. And we were covering them to turn them into neighborhoods, to turn them into factories. Down in Florida, we have many areas, the Cape Coral area, they just canaled it all off, completely drained out the wetlands to turn it into neighborhoods and communities. We've done this over and over. We'll look at a case study in the Florida Everglades. We've been doing this for a century at least. In the United States, we have lost more than half of our coastal and inland wetlands since the 1900s. In 100 years, our wetlands have been cut in half. Louisiana is losing its wetlands due to the sinking of the coastland. It's subsiding. All of their dams up along the rivers are stopping the sediments from making it down into the delta, and this is what has been replenishing the area. Well, that's not happening, and Louisiana is slowly subsiding, sinking into the sea. And of course, with global warming and the water rising, it's even worse. All those sediments that once again should be replacing it aren't making it down there, and large swaths of Louisiana are just being lost to the sea. Now, we do have laws for protection. So we have ways to both preserve and restore. Preservation tends to come in laws protecting them. Our zoning laws steer development away from wetlands. We have zoning laws now, and you say, ooh, this would be a great area. All we got to do is fill it in. Well, our zoning laws now prevent you from just building on wetlands, but with some stipulations. They say, but this is prime area. Well, what they are allowed to do is take another area and turn it into a wetland, and then you can develop on this one. So it's this kind of thing of mitigation banking. So if it's an area larger than 3 acres, now if it's an area smaller than 3 acres, it can just be filled in. Now in Gainesville, we've done a pretty good job. We keep a lot of green spaces in areas and neighborhoods that are smaller than that, but we keep them as a wetland area. But not everywhere does, at least in the United States, but smaller than 3 acres. And a yard, somebody's back or house yard is around an acre. It's probably a little smaller than that in most of Gainesville, but a decent size front and backyard is about an acre to give you an idea. So if it's smaller than 3 acres, they're just allowed to fill it in and develop on it. Bigger than 3 acres, they're not. They have to create a wetland of an equal area. So you say, ooh, this is prime real estate, we could get more money for it. So we'll fill it in and develop it, put houses, whatever. And this area over here, which isn't so good, we'll turn that into a wetlands. And it's a good idea. The only problem is the newly created wetlands, well, they weren't wetlands to begin with for a reason. So just because we dig it out and try and turn it into one, they quite often are not as productive, and they really just don't provide the same ecosystem services. And what we tend to do is kind of look, oh yes, you made a wetland, and then we don't pay attention to it again. And when that wetland fails and it just recovers back in, well, we've already developed here. This wetland wasn't properly maintained, and it really wasn't built well to begin with, and it's no longer a wetlands, and we've just lost wetlands. Sometimes they sustain, sometimes they don't. The picture up here is one that was done just outside of Orlando, Florida, where it was a converted wetland. It appears to be working pretty successfully, but unfortunately a lot of times these things really are kind of hit and miss. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Now, one of our science focus is on the beaver. Beavers are pretty interesting animals. I've only seen them a few times. They're up and down the rivers around here about 2 or 3 times. I've seen like the evidence of beavers a lot. I've only seen them live and in person a few times. And they always kind of catch me. They're a lot bigger when you see them in person than you kind of think. Every time I say, oh my goodness, that thing's pretty big, about the size of a medium-sized dog with a big fat tail. These guys are nature's engineers. They cut down trees with their teeth, I think a picture of them up here, and then they create pond habitats. They take a little stream, they build their dam in it. By building the dam, it backs up the water. They kind of create these natural little wetland areas, and this brings in a lot of organic life, whether it's fish, other things, take advantage of this situation. The beavers then build out these little hollows inside of their dams and have their waterfront housing, if you will. They're a keystone species. There's one of these guys that without them, we wouldn't have the same type of ecosystem around them. They increase the biodiversity in any area they go into. We always find more organisms and wildlife where we have beavers than when we don't. They reduce erosion. Once again, the dams coming in block things up, the water spreads out, we get more vegetation, less erosion. and they allow the sediments to settle there. So they are dams. And we talk about when we build dams, it tends to be bad. We do it in a much bigger scale than Beavers. There'll be this dam and we'll get a small area, the sediments will settle and it clears the water down the stream. And there might be another set is there. So Beavers come along, they build these fascinating dams. We get this whole ecosystem structure around them. Of course, they do not come without, some downsides, if you will. There are some environmental damage, or there's some problems for other people around. Beavers were almost killed off in the 1900s, but they've come back pretty strong. But different people are on different sides of the debate. They are a keystone species, but there are some things that they do that cause disruption, and it's a debate that's in process of where they are and how much we should allow them to come back, if you will. The other case study here is we're looking at the Everglades. And for us here in Florida, the Everglades are, something sort of near and dear to our hearts. At least it's something that we talk about, know about. Well, in the 20th century, we drained, diverted, paved over, and put tons of nutrient pollution from agriculture, which again, runoff, fertilizers going into it. And there was a whole host of invasive plant species. So many people living around and plants getting out of people's yards into the water systems. And the Everglades being a wetland was prime real estate for them to take root in. Whether it's things like kudzu or the air potato, and the list just goes on and on and on and on of invasive species, and not even mention things like boa constrictors, which have been released into the water, or fish from people's aquariums. We've just had a whole host. In 1947, the Everglades National Park was set aside, and this was a completely unmitigated disaster of a protection project. It was attempted, we put in, they did things to it, we actually caused more harm than we did good. In 1990, there was a comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, CERP, the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. This was designed to try and restore the curving flow of the Kissimmee River. So if you kind of see the map here, where the Kissimmee River we turned it into a canal, about 84 kilometers of it. Was trying to return most of that curvy flow. That it just makes a huge difference in how the water gets dumped in. We removed a lot of the canals and the levees around this area, at least in some strategic positions. We're trying to get it more to the natural, slow-moving river that it once was, because a lot of it is now dried up and drained out because of a lot of these other various development projects. We flooded a lot of farmlands to try and create some artificial marshes. Once again, kind of this idea of border areas to protect the core. 18 reservoirs have been created for a water supply for the lower Everglades, so when it does get to go dry, these reservoirs allow water to continue to flow. And we've tried to recapture a lot of this water flowing to the sea and then return it back into the Everglades. Can we try and keep a greater flow? Once again, if we can get it to heal, then the idea is that it'll repair itself. And a lot of times it's keeping enough water in it so it doesn't dry up. It dries up, other plants come in, the ground builds up, and we lose the wetlands entirely. In 2019, there was a raising of a major highway to try and connect areas of the Everglades in. So when we see this picture, we have like the Kissimmee River up there comes down into Lake Okeechobee, and from Lake Okeechobee, it used to just be this really long, slow river moving its way all the way down past Miami and eventually into the sea. We've just seen huge parts of it wind up getting dried up, drained, etc. And it's an ongoing restoration process, and we're very hopeful that it will work. When it comes to our wetlands, remember, they're not just a bug-infested swamp area. There's a lot of things that benefit all of us. And Italy's lost like 95%, Spain 90%, we've lost 50% of ours. Is something that we've got to wake up and be careful about. So when it comes to voting procedures, remember, protecting our wetlands, it's not just an area to develop and put more people on, it's really something that helps protect us all. Come back next time. We'll actually tie 5 and 6 together so we can wrap it all up nice and neat. Take care. Have a good day.